The autumn rain fell steadily on the glass ceiling of the Riverside Memorial Chapel in downtown Seattle, each droplet creating tiny rivers that distorted the gray October sky above. Inside, the soft murmur of hushed conversations filled the air, as Seattle's most prominent business leaders, philanthropists, and society figures gathered to pay their respects to Victoria Ashford, beloved wife of tech mogul Richard Ashford. The chapel was adorned with white orchids and cascading arrangements of pale roses, Victoria's favorite flowers, their delicate fragrance mixing with the scent of burning candles and the weight of collective grief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Richard stood at the front of the chapel, his tall frame rigid in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his usually commanding presence diminished by the hollow look in his dark eyes. At 42, he had built Ashford Technologies from a small startup in his garage into one of the Pacific Northwest's most successful software companies. But today, none of his achievements mattered. The woman who had stood beside him through every triumph and challenge, who had believed in his vision when he was just another programmer with big dreams, was gone. Victoria had lost her battle with a rare autoimmune disease just 3 days earlier, leaving Richard to face a future he couldn't imagine without her gentle wisdom and unwavering support. The memorial service had proceeded with the elegant dignity that Victoria would have appreciated. Colleagues spoke of her volunteer work with local literacy programs. Friends shared memories of her infectious laughter and generous spirit. And Richard himself had managed to deliver a eulogy that captured just a fraction of what his wife had meant to him and everyone whose lives she had touched. As the formal proceedings concluded and guests began to move toward the reception area, Richard found himself standing alone beside the casket, overwhelmed by the finality of the moment. The steady patter of rain against the windows provided a somber backdrop as people slowly filed past, offering their condolences with the practiced sympathy of those who understood loss but couldn't truly share its burden. Seattle's tech elite mingled with university professors, artists, and community leaders, all united in their respect for Victoria's memory. Richard nodded mechanically at each expression of sympathy, his mind struggling to process the reality that this gathering marked the end of one chapter of his life and the terrifying beginning of another. As the crowd began to thin and staff members started the delicate process of preparing for the next service, Richard noticed a small figure sitting alone in the back row of the chapel. A young girl, perhaps 7 years old, sat perfectly still, with her hands folded in her lap, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a navy blue dress that looked carefully pressed but not expensive. She seemed out of place among the well-dressed adults, her small frame dwarfed by the large wooden pew. Yet there was something about her stillness that commanded attention. Richard found himself studying the child, wondering who she might be. He and Victoria had never been blessed with children of their own, a source of quiet sadness that they had learned to accept over the years. They had channeled their parental instincts into mentoring young entrepreneurs and supporting educational programs, but the sight of this solitary little girl stirred something unexpected in his chest. She appeared to be alone, with no adult guardian visible nearby, which struck him as odd given the formal nature of the gathering. The girl seemed to sense his attention and turned her head slightly, revealing large brown eyes that held an unusual depth for someone so young. When their gazes met, she didn't look away with the typical shyness of a child caught staring. Instead, she maintained eye contact with a steadiness that was both unsettling and somehow familiar. There was something in her expression that reminded him of Victoria, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. As the last of the guests filtered out into the reception area, the girl rose from her seat and began walking slowly down the center aisle toward where Richard stood. Her steps were measured and purposeful, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment when they would be alone together. She clutched something in her small hand, and as she drew closer, Richard could see it was a sealed envelope. Slightly wrinkled as if it had been carried for some time, the chapel had grown quiet, except for the continued drumming of rain overhead and the distant sounds of conversation from the adjoining room. Richard watched as the girl approached, his curiosity mixing with concern about why a child would be unaccompanied at such an event. When she stopped directly in front of him, barely reaching his waist in height, she looked up with those remarkably serious brown eyes and extended the envelope toward him. "This is for you, Mr. Ashford," she said in a clear, soft voice that carried a slight tremor of nervousness. "My mum wanted you to have it." Richard stared down at the envelope, his name written across the front in handwriting he didn't immediately recognize. The letters were formed with careful precision, as if the writer had taken great care with each stroke of the pen. He looked back at the girl, searching her face for any clue about who she might be or how she had come to be here. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently, crouching down to her eye level. "Sophie," she replied, still holding out the envelope. "Sophie Martinez." The name meant nothing to Richard, but something about the way she said it, with such solemnity and purpose, made him realize this was no random encounter. He accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, noting its weight and the way the paper felt substantial between his fingers. "Where is your mom, Sophie?" he asked, glancing around the now empty chapel. Sophie's expression grew even more serious, if that were possible for such a young child. "She couldn't come," she said quietly. "She's in heaven now, like your wife." The simple words hit Richard like a physical blow. This little girl, who couldn't be more than 7 years old, had also experienced the devastating loss of a parent. He felt his throat tighten with emotion as he looked at her composed face, wondering how long she had been carrying this grief and who was caring for her now. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Sophie," he said, meaning every word. "When did your mum pass away?" 2 months ago, she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was sharing. "She was sick for a long time, but she made sure to write that letter before she died. She said it was very important that you get it, especially if something happened to your wife too." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Richard's mind reeled as he tried to process this information. A mother he apparently didn't know had written him a letter before her death, instructed her young daughter to deliver it, and somehow known that Victoria would also pass away. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet here was this child standing before him with physical proof that it was real. "Sophie, who's taking care of you now?" he asked, his protective instincts awakening. "My tia Rosa," she said, using the Spanish word for aunt. "She's waiting outside in the car. She said I could come in by myself because this was something I had to do alone." Richard nodded, understanding that this moment had been carefully orchestrated by the adults in Sophie's life. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure this letter reached him, and they had entrusted a 7-year-old girl with the responsibility of delivering it at his wife's memorial service. The weight of that trust wasn't lost on him. "Would you like me to read it now?" he asked, though part of him was afraid of what the letter might contain. Sophie nodded solemnly. "Mom said you should read it when you were ready, but that it might help you understand some things." "Indeed." With fingers that felt clumsy with emotion, Richard carefully opened the envelope, revealing several pages of the same careful handwriting he had seen on the front. As he unfolded the letter, he noticed a small photograph tucked between the pages. It showed a woman with Sophie's dark hair and eyes, smiling warmly at the camera while holding a baby who was unmistakably a younger version of the girl standing before him. Richard began to read, and with each word, his world shifted in ways he never could have anticipated. "Dear Richard," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that Sophie has found the courage to approach you, and that my worst fears about my illness have come to pass. My name is Elena Martinez, and 8 years ago, you knew me as Elena Rodriguez before I married and took my husband's name. I pray that you remember me, because what I have to tell you will change both our lives forever." Richard's hands began to shake as memories flooded back. Elena Rodriguez. He did remember her, though the recollection came with a sharp pang of regret and long-buried guilt. 8 years ago, he had been working as a senior developer at a mid-sized tech company, ambitious and driven, but not yet the successful entrepreneur he would later become. Elena had been a project manager at the same company, brilliant and organized, with a warm smile that could light up even the most stressful workday. Their relationship had been brief but intense, a whirlwind romance that had burned bright for 3 months before circumstances tore them apart. Richard had been offered a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to join a startup in San Francisco, a chance to be part of something revolutionary that could launch his career to new heights. Elena had been supportive but realistic about the challenges of maintaining a long-distance relationship when both of their careers were demanding so much of their time and energy. They had made promises to stay in touch, to visit when possible, to see if their connection could survive the distance and the demands of their respective ambitions. But as weeks turned into months, phone calls became less frequent, emails grew shorter and more sporadic, and eventually they had drifted apart in the way that young, career-focused people often do when life pulls them in different directions. Richard continued reading, his heart pounding, as Elena's words revealed truths he had never suspected. "I discovered I was pregnant just 2 weeks after you left for San Francisco," the letter continued. "I called your office, but they said you had already relocated, and they couldn't give me your new contact information. I tried reaching out through mutual friends, but everyone said you were completely focused on your new opportunity and didn't want any distractions from your old life. I interpreted this as a sign that you had moved on completely, and I made a decision that I've questioned every day since." Richard felt sick as he read these words, remembering how consumed he had been with his new position, how he had deliberately cut ties with his former life to avoid any temptation to look backward instead of embracing the future. He had never received any calls from Elena, had never known she was trying to reach him. The thought that she had been pregnant and alone while he was chasing his dreams in California filled him with a guilt so profound it threatened to overwhelm him. "I decided not to pursue contacting you further," Elena's letter continued. "I told myself it was because I didn't want to disrupt your new life, but if I'm being honest, it was also because I was afraid of rejection. I was afraid you would see a baby as an obligation, a burden that would derail the success you had worked so hard to achieve. So I made the choice to raise our daughter alone, and I named her Sophie Elena Martinez, giving her my married name when I wed my dear friend Carlos, 2 years later." The word daughter seemed to leap off the page, and Richard looked up at Sophie with new eyes. This serious, composed little girl who had approached him with such purpose was his daughter, his child, the daughter he and Victoria had longed for but never been able to have. She had been alive all this time, growing up without him, while he had built his fortune and married the love of his life, never knowing that somewhere in Seattle, a little girl carried his DNA and possibly his dreams. Sophie watched him read with patient intensity, as if she understood the magnitude of what was being revealed. When she saw the recognition dawn in his eyes, she nodded slightly, confirming what the letter had told him. Carlos was a wonderful stepfather to Sophie, Elena's letter continued, but he passed away in a car accident when she was 4. Since then, it has been just the two of us, and I have done my best to give her everything she needs. She is an extraordinary child, Richard. She has your analytical mind and your determination, but also a gentleness and empathy that I like to think she inherited from both of us. She excels in school, particularly in mathematics and science, and she has an intuitive understanding of how things work that reminds me so much of you. Richard found himself studying Sophie's face more intently, looking for traces of himself in her features. Her eyes, while brown like her mother's, had a familiar intensity when she concentrated. The way she stood, perfectly still and observant, reminded him of his own childhood habit of watching and analyzing before acting. Even her careful, deliberate speech patterns echoed his own tendency to think before speaking. I am writing this letter because I have been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, Elena's words continued, and Richard felt his heart clench with sympathy for what this woman had endured. The doctors have given me 6 months, perhaps less, and I need to make arrangements for Sophie's future. My sister Rosa has agreed to take custody of her, and Rosa is a wonderful woman who will love Sophie as her own. But I realized that Sophie deserves to know who her biological father is, and you deserve to know that you have a daughter. The weight of responsibility and missed opportunities crashed down on Richard like a physical force. While he had been building his company and establishing his wealth, his daughter had been growing up without him. While he and Victoria had been mourning their inability to have children, his child had been living just a few hours' drive away, experiencing her own losses and challenges. I have followed your career over the years, Elena's letter continued, and I am so proud of what you have accomplished. I read about your marriage to Victoria, and I could see from the photographs that you had found happiness and love. I never wanted to disrupt that, which is why I made the decision not to contact you while I was healthy. But now, facing my own mortality, I realize that my choice may have deprived both you and Sophie of something precious. Richard thought about Victoria and how she would have reacted to this news. His wife had possessed a generous heart and an infinite capacity for love. She would have embraced Sophie without hesitation, would have been grateful for the opportunity to be a mother figure to a child who needed guidance and care. The irony that this revelation was coming at Victoria's memorial service seemed almost cosmic in its timing. I have told Sophie about you, the letter continued. I have shared stories about your intelligence, your ambition, and your kind heart. I have shown her pictures of you that I kept from our time together, and I have watched her face light up with curiosity about the father she has never met. She knows that you didn't know about her, and she understands that my decision to raise her alone was mine, not yours. She is remarkably mature for her age, perhaps because she has had to be, but she is still a 7-year-old girl who dreams about having a father who might teach her about science and technology and who might be proud of her accomplishments. Richard glanced at Sophie again, seeing her with entirely new eyes. This wasn't just a random child who had wandered into his wife's memorial service. This was his daughter, who had been carefully prepared for this moment by a dying mother, who wanted to give her the chance at a relationship she had never had. The courage it must have taken for Elena to write this letter, knowing she was dying, knowing she was about to change the life of a man she hadn't spoken to in 8 years, was almost incomprehensible. If you are reading this letter, it means I am gone, and Sophie has successfully found you at what I can only imagine is a difficult time in your own life. Elena's words continued with prophetic accuracy. I heard about Victoria's illness through mutual acquaintances in the tech community, and my heart breaks for what you must be going through. I know what it means to lose someone you love, and I know the emptiness that follows such a profound loss. The fact that Elena had known about Victoria's illness and had still instructed Sophie to approach him at the memorial service spoke to a level of planning and consideration that amazed Richard. This woman had been dying herself, yet she had taken the time to consider his grief and had chosen this moment specifically because she understood he would need hope and purpose in the wake of his loss. "I am not writing this letter to ask you for anything," Elena continued. "You have no legal obligations to Sophie, and Rosa is fully prepared to raise her with love and care. But if you find yourself wanting to know your daughter, if you feel that perhaps fate has brought this news to you at a time when you might need family as much as she does, then I hope you will consider opening your heart to the possibility of a relationship with her." Richard looked at Sophie, who had remained perfectly still and patient while he read, her small hands now clasped in front of her as she waited for his reaction. The composure of this 7-year-old girl who had just delivered news that would change his entire understanding of his life was remarkable. She seemed to sense the gravity of the moment while also maintaining the innocent hope of a child who had dreamed of meeting her father. "Sophie is staying with Rosa in the Ballard neighborhood, and I have enclosed their contact information should you wish to reach out," the letter continued. "I want you to know that Sophie has always been curious about you, but I have never pressured her to seek you out. This decision to have her deliver this letter was made jointly after many conversations about what it might mean for both of your lives." The final paragraph of Elena's letter made Richard's eyes fill with tears that he had been holding back throughout the reading. "Whatever you decide, please know that Sophie is the greatest joy of my life, and I believe she would be a joy in yours as well if you give her the chance. She has your brilliant mind and your determination, but she also has a tender heart and a generous spirit that makes her truly special. I am trusting you with the most precious thing in my world, and I hope that in time you might come to treasure her as much as I do. All my love and hope for both your futures, Elena." Richard carefully folded the letter, his hands trembling with emotion as he processed everything he had just learned. His entire life had changed in the space of a few minutes, and he was struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what this meant. He had a daughter, a 7-year-old girl who had been raised by a woman who had loved her enough to let her go in search of the father she had never known. Sophie continued to watch him with those serious brown eyes, and he realized she was waiting for some kind of response from him. This child had just delivered the most life-altering news he had ever received, and she was standing there with the patience and dignity of someone far beyond her years, giving him time to process what her mother had written. "Sophie," he said, softly, his voice thick with emotion, "do you understand what your mother told me in this letter?" She nodded solemnly. "She told you that you're my daddy," she said simply. "She said you didn't know about me because she never told you, but that it wasn't your fault." The word daddy, spoken in her clear, innocent voice, nearly broke Richard's composure entirely. This beautiful, composed little girl was his daughter, and she was calling him daddy, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "How do you feel about that?" he asked, crouching down to her level again so they could speak eye to eye. Sophie considered the question with the seriousness she seemed to apply to everything. "I feel happy," she said finally. "I've always wondered what it would be like to have a daddy, and Mama said you were a good man who would love me if you knew about me." Richard felt tears threatening to spill over as he looked at this remarkable child who was handling this monumental revelation with such grace and maturity. The idea that she had spent 7 years wondering about him, hoping to meet him someday, while he had been completely unaware of her existence, filled him with both overwhelming love and profound regret. "I would very much like to get to know you, Sophie," he said, his voice catching with emotion. "Would you like that too?" Her serious expression brightened into the first genuine smile he had seen from her, and in that moment he caught a glimpse of the joyful child beneath the composed exterior she had maintained throughout this difficult conversation. "Yes," she said, and for the first time she sounded like the 7-year-old she was, rather than the wise little messenger she had been forced to become. "I would like that very much." As they stood together in the empty chapel, with the rain continuing to fall on the glass ceiling above them, and the memory of Victoria's service still fresh in the air, Richard felt the beginning of something he hadn't expected to experience again after his wife's death. Hope, purpose, the possibility that even in the midst of profound loss, life could offer unexpected gifts that might help heal the wounds left behind. Sophie reached out and took his hand with a naturalness that surprised him, her small fingers intertwining with his as if they had known each other for years rather than minutes. In that simple gesture, Richard felt the beginning of a bond that he knew would grow into something profound and life-changing for both of them. "Would you like to meet my Tia Rosa?" Sophie asked, looking toward the chapel entrance where her aunt was presumably waiting. "I would love to meet her," Richard replied, still marveling at the fact that he was holding hands with his daughter, a child whose existence had been unknown to him just moments earlier. As they walked together toward the entrance of the chapel, Richard's mind was already racing with questions and possibilities. He wanted to know everything about Sophie's life, her interests, her dreams, her favorite foods and colors and books. He wanted to understand what Elena had been like as a mother, how she had shaped this extraordinary little girl who had approached him with such courage and purpose. But mostly, he wanted to begin the process of building a relationship with the daughter he had never known he had, a child who had just transformed his grief into something that felt remarkably like hope for the future. The letter Elena had written had indeed changed everything, but perhaps most importantly, it had given both Richard and Sophie the chance to discover what it meant to be father and daughter, even under the most unexpected and bittersweet of circumstances. The drive to the Ballard neighborhood took Richard through familiar Seattle streets that somehow looked different now, as if the revelation of Sophie's existence had altered the very lens through which he viewed the world. Sophie sat quietly in the passenger seat of his Tesla, her small hands folded in her lap as she gazed out the window at the city passing by. She had insisted on riding with him to meet her aunt, displaying the same quiet determination that had characterized her approach to him at the chapel. Rosa Martinez lived in a modest craftsman-style house on a tree-lined street where children's bicycles dotted front yards and Halloween decorations adorned porches in preparation for the approaching holiday. As Richard pulled into the driveway behind a well-worn Honda Civic, he felt a surge of nervousness that surprised him. In boardrooms and investor meetings, he commanded respect and confidence, but the prospect of meeting the woman who had been caring for his daughter filled him with uncertainty about how to navigate this entirely new territory. Rosa emerged from the house before they could knock, a woman in her early 40s, with Sophie's dark hair streaked with premature gray and kind eyes that held a mixture of curiosity and protective concern. She wore simple jeans and a cardigan, and her smile was warm but cautious as she approached them on the front walkway. Sophie immediately ran to her, wrapping her arms around Rosa's waist in a gesture that spoke of deep affection and security. "Tia Rosa, this is Richard," Sophie said with the formal politeness of a child who had been well taught in manners. He read Mama's letter. Rosa studied Richard's face intently, and he could see her searching for resemblances between him and the niece she had been raising. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy some internal question because her expression softened slightly. As she extended her hand in greeting, "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that hinted at her Mexican heritage. Elena told me so much about you over the years. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm grateful that Sophie found the courage to approach you today." Richard shook her hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work and the gentle strength in her grip. This was a woman who had stepped up to raise her sister's child without hesitation, who had supported Elena through her illness and death, who had somehow managed to raise Sophie into the remarkable little girl he had just met. "Please, call me, Richard," he said, "and thank you for taking such wonderful care of Sophie." Elena's letter made it clear how much thought went into this moment. Rosa nodded, gesturing toward the house. "Would you like to come in? Sophie has been preparing for weeks for this day, and I think there are some things she wants to show you." The interior of the house was warm and lived in, with photographs covering the mantelpiece and children's artwork adorning the refrigerator. Richard could see evidence of Sophie's presence everywhere. Textbooks stacked neatly on a small desk by the window, a science fair project about renewable energy displayed prominently on the dining room table, and a collection of advanced mathematics, workbooks that seemed far beyond what he would expect for a 7-year-old. "Sophie is intellectually gifted," Rosa explained, noticing his attention to the academic materials. "She's actually working at a 4th grade level in most subjects, but especially in mathematics and science. Elena always said she got that from you." Sophie had disappeared down a hallway, and Richard could hear her moving around in what he assumed was her bedroom. Rosa gestured for him to sit on the comfortable but well-worn couch, and she took the chair across from him with the air of someone prepared for a serious conversation. "I need you to understand something, Richard," Rosa began, her voice gentle but firm. "Sophie is an extraordinary child, but she's also been through tremendous loss for someone so young. Elena's death hit her very hard, even though we had months to prepare for it. She's been seeing a counselor and she's doing well, but she's also very sensitive to abandonment and disappointment." Richard nodded, understanding the warning beneath Rosa's words. "I want you to know that I have no intention of disappearing from Sophie's life. Learning about her existence has changed everything for me, and I want to be the father she deserves." "That's what Elena hoped you would say," Rosa replied. "But I need to know that you understand what that means. Being a parent isn't something you can do part-time or when it's convenient. Sophie needs stability and consistency, especially now." Before Richard could respond, Sophie reappeared, carrying a small wooden box and a thick photo album. She had changed from her formal dress into jeans and a purple sweater, and her hair was now loose around her shoulders, making her look more like the child she was, rather than the serious little messenger who had approached him at the chapel. "I want to show you something," Sophie said, settling herself on the couch beside Richard with a naturalness that surprised him. She opened the photo album to the first page, revealing pictures of Eleanor during her pregnancy. "Mama made this book about me for you. She said if I ever found you, you would want to know about all the things you missed." Richard's throat tightened as he looked at photos of Elena's growing belly, images of a baby nursery being prepared, ultrasound pictures that showed his daughter's development before birth. Elena had documented everything, creating a visual record of Sophie's early life that she had somehow known he would want to see someday. "This is me when I was born," Sophie said, turning to a page filled with hospital photos. "I was 6 pounds and 4 ounces, and Mama said I came 2 weeks early because I was impatient to meet the world." As they turned through the pages together, Richard saw his daughter's first smile, her first steps, her first day of school. Elena had been meticulous in her documentation, including handwritten notes about Sophie's development, her personality quirks, her favorite foods and toys. It was clear that every photo had been taken with the thought that someday Sophie's father might want to know these details about her early years. "Mama started getting sick when I was 6, Sophie explained, as they reached photos that showed Elena looking increasingly frail, but she kept taking pictures because she said memories were the most important things we could leave for the people we love. Richard noticed that many of the later photos showed Sophie and Elena working together on various projects, building a robot for a school science fair, conducting chemistry experiments at the kitchen table, reading together in bed during Elena's more difficult days. It was clear that despite her illness, Elena had remained actively involved in Sophie's education and development until the very end. "She taught me about computer programming," Sophie said, opening the wooden box to reveal a collection of notebooks filled with code. "She said you were really good at understanding how computers work, and she wanted me to learn about it too." Richard examined the notebooks, amazed by the sophistication of the programming concepts Sophie had been learning. These weren't simple children's coding exercises, but actual functional programs written in Python and JavaScript. For a 7-year-old to grasp these concepts was remarkable, and it confirmed what Elena had written about Sophie inheriting his analytical abilities. "What kind of programs do you like to write?" Richard asked, genuinely curious about his daughter's interests and capabilities. Sophie's face lit up with enthusiasm, the first time he had seen her display the uninhibited excitement typical of a child her age. "I made a program that helps me with my math homework, and another one that tracks the weather patterns for my science project. But my favorite is the one I wrote that sorts all of Mama's photos by date and creates albums automatically." The technical complexity of what Sophie was describing impressed Richard immensely. These weren't simple programming exercises, but practical applications that demonstrated real problem-solving skills and creative thinking. The idea that his 7-year-old daughter had taught herself to write programs that could organize digital photos was both astounding and deeply moving, especially knowing that she had probably created it to help preserve memories of her mother. "Would you like to see my computer setup?" Sophie asked, already standing and heading toward her bedroom. "Tia Rosa helped me move everything when I came to live here." Sophie's bedroom was a fascinating blend of typical little girl interests and advanced academic pursuits. Stuffed animals shared shelf space with programming manuals, and colorful artwork hung alongside printouts of her coding projects. Her desk held a computer that was clearly several years old, but had been carefully maintained and upgraded with additional memory and processing power. "Mum and I built this computer together," Sophie explained with obvious pride. "She said it was important for me to understand how all the parts work together, not just how to use the programs." Richard examined the computer setup, noting the quality of the components and the careful cable management that spoke of someone who understood proper system assembly. The monitor displayed a development environment with multiple windows open, showing that Sophie had been working on several different programming projects simultaneously. "This is really impressive, Sophie," Richard said, meaning every word. "Your understanding of these concepts is remarkable for someone your age." Sophie beamed at the praise, and Richard could see how much his approval meant to her. It occurred to him that she had probably been hungry for this kind of recognition from someone who could truly appreciate her abilities, someone who understood the technical aspects of what she was accomplishing. "I have an idea," Richard said, an inspiration striking him. "Would you like to visit my office sometime? I think you might be interested in seeing the kind of work we do at my company." Sophie's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? You would take me to see where you work?" "If Tia Rosa thinks it's okay," Richard said, glancing at Rosa for permission. "I think you might enjoy meeting some of my software engineers and seeing our development labs." Rosa nodded her approval, though Richard could see she was still evaluating his every interaction with Sophie, watching for signs that he was sincere in his interest rather than simply going through the motions of newfound fatherhood. They spent the next 2 hours talking, with Sophie showing Richard more of her projects and Rosa sharing stories about Sophie's academic achievements and personality. Richard learned that his daughter was not only intellectually gifted, but also remarkably empathetic and responsible for her age. She had helped care for Elena during her final months, understanding medical schedules and medication requirements with a maturity that spoke of her early exposure to adult responsibilities. She never complained, Rosa said as Sophie worked at her computer, showing Richard a program she was writing to calculate compound interest. Even when Elena was very sick and needed a lot of care, Sophie would help with everything from cooking simple meals to organizing medication schedules. Richard felt a mixture of pride and sadness as he thought about his daughter shouldering such responsibilities at such a young age. He wanted to give her the childhood she deserved, filled with play and discovery rather than the weight of adult concerns she had been forced to carry. As the afternoon progressed, Richard found himself falling naturally into conversation with Sophie about topics ranging from artificial intelligence to space exploration. Her questions were thoughtful and her observations surprisingly sophisticated, confirming Elena's assessment of her intellectual capabilities. More importantly, he could see traces of his own curiosity and analytical approach to problem solving in the way she approached new concepts. When it came time for Richard to leave, Sophie walked him to the door with a seriousness that had returned to her demeanor. She seemed to be processing the events of the day and considering what this new relationship might mean for her future. "Will I see you again soon?" she asked, and Richard could hear the carefully controlled hope in her voice. "Absolutely," Richard replied, kneeling down to her level. "Would you like to have dinner with me this weekend? We could go somewhere you like, and maybe afterward we could visit my office if you're still interested." Sophie nodded eagerly, then surprised him by stepping forward and giving him a brief but heartfelt hug. The gesture was tentative, as if she was testing the boundaries of their new relationship, but it filled Richard with a warmth he hadn't expected. As he drove home through the darkening Seattle streets, Richard's mind raced with plans and possibilities. He thought about the guest room in his Bellevue penthouse that could be converted into a bedroom for Sophie, about the schools in his district that might better challenge her academically, about the opportunities he could provide for her continued intellectual development. But more than the practical considerations, he found himself thinking about the little girl who had approached him with such courage and dignity, who had delivered news that would forever change his understanding of his own life. Sophie was extraordinary, not just because of her intelligence, but because of her resilience, her compassion, and her remarkable ability to handle difficult situations with grace far beyond her years. That evening, Richard called his lawyer to begin the process of understanding his legal rights and responsibilities as Sophie's biological father. He wanted to ensure that whatever relationship developed between them would be properly structured to protect Sophie's interests and provide her with the security she needed. He also spent hours researching child development, gifted education, programs, and the psychological effects of early parental loss. If he was going to be Sophie's father, he wanted to be prepared to meet her needs, not just as a provider, but as someone who could understand and support her emotional and intellectual development. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as Richard began making arrangements for Sophie's visit to his office. He wanted everything to be perfect, knowing that this would be an important step in building their relationship. He briefed his key staff members about Sophie's visit, emphasizing that she was intellectually gifted and should be treated with the respect accorded to a colleague rather than condescended to as a typical child. Meanwhile, Sophie was having her own preparations for their dinner date. Rosa helped her select an outfit that was both appropriate for a nice restaurant and comfortable enough for exploring Richard's office afterward. Sophie practiced questions she wanted to ask about his work and prepared to show him some new programming projects she had completed since his visit. The restaurant Richard chose was elegant but family-friendly, with a quiet atmosphere that would allow for conversation. When he arrived to pick up Sophie, he found her waiting on the front porch with Rosa, dressed in a navy blue dress with her hair neatly braided, looking both excited and nervous about their first official outing together. "You look very nice, Sophie," Richard said, meaning it sincerely. "Are you ready for our adventure?" Sophie nodded, hugging Rosa goodbye and promising to be on her best behavior. As they drove toward the restaurant, Richard found himself marveling at how natural it felt to have his daughter beside him, chattering about her week at school and asking questions about the city passing by outside the windows. At dinner, Sophie impressed the waitstaff with her polite manners and thoughtful questions about the menu. She ordered salmon because she had read that omega-3 fatty acids were important for brain development, a choice that made Richard smile. At her practical approach to nutrition, their conversation flowed easily, covering topics from her favorite subjects in school to her dreams of someday working in technology, like her father. "I want to create programs that help people," Sophie said as they shared dessert. "Mama always said that technology should make life better for everyone, not just the people who can afford it." Richard felt a surge of pride at his daughter's altruistic goals and her mature understanding of technology's potential for social good. Elena had clearly instilled strong values in Sophie, and Richard was determined to continue nurturing those principles as their relationship developed. After dinner, they drove to Richard's office building in South Lake Union, where Sophie's eyes widened at the modern glass structure that housed Ashford Technologies. The building's lobby featured interactive displays showcasing the company's various software products, and Sophie studied each one with intense curiosity. "This is where you work every day?" she asked as they rode the elevator to the executive floors. "This is where the magic happens," Richard replied, enjoying her obvious excitement about seeing his professional world. The office itself was a masterpiece of modern design, with open work areas, collaborative spaces, and state-of-the-art technology visible throughout. Even though it was evening and most employees had gone home, the few remaining staff members were delighted to meet Sophie and impressed by her knowledgeable questions about their work. Richard's personal office occupied a corner of the building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. Sophie stood at the windows for several minutes, taking in the view and asking questions about the various landmarks visible in the distance. "It's beautiful," she said simply, and Richard realized that sharing this view with his daughter somehow made it more meaningful than it had ever been when he experienced it alone. They spent an hour exploring the office, with Richard explaining the various projects his teams were working on, and Sophie offering surprisingly insightful observations about potential improvements and applications. Her questions demonstrated not only her technical understanding, but also her ability to think creatively about problem-solving approaches. As they prepared to leave, Sophie turned to Richard with a serious expression that he was beginning to recognize as her way of processing important thoughts. "Thank you for showing me your work," she said formally. "I understand now why Mama was so proud when she talked about what you had accomplished." The comment caught Richard off guard, and he felt his throat tighten with emotion at the thought that Elena had spoken proudly of his achievements to their daughter over the years. "Your mother was a remarkable woman, Sophie," he replied. "Everything good about you comes from her love and guidance." Sophie considered this for a moment, then surprised him with her response. "Mama always said I was half her and half you, and that meant I had twice as many reasons to be proud of who I am." The wisdom and maturity of her words left Richard speechless, and he realized that Eleanor had prepared Sophie for this moment with the same careful thought and love that had characterized everything else about her approach to motherhood. As he drove Sophie back to Rosa's house that evening, Richard reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few days. The grief over Victoria's death hadn't disappeared, but it had been joined by something unexpected: hope for a future filled with the joy of watching his daughter grow and develop her remarkable potential. Sophie fell asleep during the drive home, her head resting against the car window as the city lights passed by outside. Richard found himself stealing glances at her peaceful face, marveling at the reality that this extraordinary little girl was his daughter, that somehow fate had brought them together at exactly the moment when they both needed family most. When they arrived at Rosa's house, Richard gently woke Sophie and walked her to the door, where Rosa was waiting with a warm smile and obvious relief at seeing them both looking happy and relaxed. "Did you have a good time?" Rosa asked as Sophie hugged her goodnight. "The best time," Sophie replied sleepily. "Richard showed me his whole office, and I got to meet real software engineers, and we talked about artificial intelligence and machine learning and everything." Rosa laughed at Sophie's enthusiastic summary, then looked at Richard with an expression of growing approval. "It sounds like you two are getting along well." "Better than I ever hoped," Richard replied honestly. "Sophie is an amazing kid, and I feel incredibly lucky to have the chance to be part of her life." As he drove home through the quiet Seattle streets, Richard found himself making mental lists of all the things he wanted to share with Sophie, all the experiences he wanted to give her, all the ways he could support her continued growth and development. For the first time since Victoria's death, he felt a sense of purpose and excitement about the future. The following week established a pattern that would become the foundation of their developing relationship. Richard arranged his schedule to have dinner with Sophie and Rosa twice during the week, and they spent Saturday afternoons together, exploring various educational and cultural activities around Seattle. Sophie proved to be an eager companion for visits to science museums, technology exhibitions, and even a robotics competition at the University of Washington, where she asked questions that impressed the participating graduate students. Each interaction revealed new facets of Sophie's personality and capabilities. She was not only intellectually gifted, but also remarkably observant about people and social dynamics. During a visit to the Pacific Science Center, she noticed when other children seemed left out of group activities and made efforts to include them. At a coding workshop for young people, she patiently helped younger children understand concepts that came naturally to her. Richard found himself learning as much from Sophie as he was teaching her. Her questions forced him to think about familiar concepts in new ways, and her perspective on various issues often surprised him with its depth and originality. More importantly, he began to understand the profound responsibility of being a parent to a child who was not only intellectually advanced, but also emotionally sensitive and still processing the loss of her mother. The turning point in their relationship came during their third weekend together, when Sophie asked if she could spend the night at Richard's apartment. The request was made casually during dinner at a small restaurant near Pike Place Market, but Richard could sense the significance of what she was asking. "I've never stayed overnight anywhere except with Tia Rosa since Mama died," Sophie explained, "but I think I would like to try staying with you if that's okay." Richard felt his heart swell with emotion at the trust implicit in her request. "I would love to have you stay over, Sophie. We could set up the guest room for you and maybe work on some programming projects together." Sophie's face lit up with excitement, and Richard realized that this represented a major step forward in their developing father-daughter relationship. She was ready to trust him not just with her time and attention, but with her vulnerability and need for security. That Saturday evening, Sophie arrived at Richard's Bellevue penthouse with a small overnight bag and her laptop computer, ready for her first sleepover with her father. Richard had prepared the guest room with care, ensuring that Sophie would have everything she needed to feel comfortable and secure. The apartment itself seemed to come alive with Sophie's presence in a way it never had before. Her laughter echoed in rooms that had been silent for too long, and her curiosity about everything from the smart home technology to the view of Lake Washington brought new energy to spaces that had felt empty since Victoria's death. They spent the evening working together on a programming project that combined Sophie's interest in environmental science with Richard's expertise in data analysis. Together, they created a simple application that could track and visualize air quality data from various monitoring stations around Seattle, turning dry statistics into colorful, interactive charts that made the information more accessible and engaging. "This is exactly the kind of work I want to do when I grow up," Sophie said, as they debugged their code together. Using technology to help people understand important information about their environment. Richard felt a profound sense of connection as he worked alongside his daughter, watching her mind process complex problems and develop creative solutions. This was more than just a father teaching his child. This was a collaboration between two people who shared not only genetics, but also a passion for using technology to make the world better. As the evening progressed and bedtime approached, Sophie grew quieter and more thoughtful. Richard sensed that she might be feeling some anxiety about sleeping in an unfamiliar place, so far from the comfort and security of Rosa's house. "Are you feeling okay about staying overnight?" he asked gently as they finished their project. Sophie nodded, but he could see uncertainty in her eyes. "It's just that I sometimes have dreams about Mama, and I get scared when I wake up and don't know where I am." Richard's heart ached for his daughter and the trauma she had experienced at such a young age. He wanted to comfort her, but wasn't sure how to navigate this new territory of providing emotional support and security. "Would it help if I stayed nearby tonight?" he offered. "I could work in the living room, and you could call for me if you need anything." Sophie considered this offer seriously, then nodded with obvious relief. "That would make me feel better. Thank you for understanding." That night, as Sophie slept in the guest room and Richard worked quietly in the adjacent living space, he reflected on the profound changes that had occurred in his life over the past few weeks. He had gone from being a successful but lonely widower to being the father of an extraordinary little girl who was teaching him new things about love, responsibility, and the meaning of family every day. The next morning, Sophie woke up refreshed and excited, chattering over breakfast about plans for the day and ideas for new programming projects they could work on together. The overnight stay had been a success, and Richard could see that it had strengthened the bond of trust between them. As he drove Sophie back to Rosa's house that Sunday afternoon, she surprised him with a question that had clearly been on her mind. "Richard," she said, using his first name as she had since their first meeting, "would it be okay if I started calling you Dad sometimes?" The question hit Richard with unexpected emotional force, and he had to pull over to the side of the road to compose himself before responding. Sophie waited patiently, seeming to understand the significance of what she had asked. "Sophie," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "there is nothing in the world that would make me happier than hearing you call me Dad." Sophie smiled, the bright, joyful expression he was beginning to treasure above all others. "Okay, Dad," she said, trying out the word and seeming pleased with how it sounded. As they completed the drive to Rosa's house, Richard felt as though another piece of his heart had clicked into place. He was no longer just Richard Ashford, successful entrepreneur and recent widower. He was Sophie's dad, with all the responsibilities and joys that title entailed, The foundation of their relationship had been built through these early weeks of careful exploration and growing trust. Sophie had shown remarkable resilience and maturity in opening her heart to the father she had never known, while Richard had discovered reserves of patience and nurturing instincts he hadn't known he possessed. But this was still just the beginning of their journey together, and both father and daughter sensed that greater challenges and deeper connections lay ahead as they continued to build their new family relationship on the foundation of love, trust, and shared dreams for the future. The autumn leaves had given way to winter's first frost when Sophie made a discovery that would test the strength of the bond she and Richard had been building over the past 3 months. It was a Thursday evening in December, and Sophie was staying overnight at Richard's apartment for what had become their regular midweek arrangement. She had been working on a school project about family genealogy, researching her heritage for a presentation she would give to her advanced placement class, while Richard was in his home office taking an important conference call with investors in Tokyo. Sophie had been using his computer in the living room to access online genealogy databases. Her research had started simply enough, tracing Rosa's family lineage through Mexico and Elena's ancestry back to Spain. But as she dug deeper into public records, her natural curiosity and remarkable analytical skills led her down an unexpected path of discovery. It began when she found Eleanor's death certificate online, which listed Sophie's birth certificate number in the related documents section. Following that thread with the methodical approach Richard was beginning to recognize as distinctly her own, Sophie accessed her birth certificate through the state's online record system. What she found there stopped her cold and sent her mind reeling with questions she wasn't sure she was ready to ask. The birth certificate listed Elena Rodriguez as the mother, but in the space marked for father's name, instead of the blank Sophie had always assumed would be there, she found a name that made her heart race: Richard James Ashford. The document was dated just 3 days after her birth, meaning Elena had listed Richard as Sophie's father from the very beginning, despite never contacting him about her pregnancy. Sophie stared at the screen for several minutes, her brilliant mind processing the implications of what she had discovered. The careful story Elena had told about not being able to reach Richard, about making the difficult decision to raise Sophie alone, suddenly seemed more complex than she had been led to believe. If Elena had put Richard's name on the birth certificate, she had obviously known exactly who he was and where to find him. The 7-year-old girl who had approached Richard at Victoria's memorial service had done so believing she was following her mother's final wishes to unite her with the father who had never known she existed. Now, staring at documented proof that Richard's name had been officially recorded as her father from the moment of her birth, Sophie felt confused and betrayed in ways she didn't fully understand. When Richard finished his call and came looking for Sophie, he found her sitting motionless in front of the computer, her face pale and her usual animated expression replaced by something that looked almost like shock. The birth certificate was still displayed on the screen, and Richard felt his own heart skip a beat as he realized what Sophie had discovered. "Sophie," he said gently, sitting down beside her on the couch. "What are you looking at, sweetheart?" Sophie turned to face him, and Richard was alarmed to see tears forming in her eyes. Throughout all their time together, through discussions about Elena's death, and even during some of her nightmares about losing her mother, Sophie had maintained remarkable composure. Seeing her this upset filled Richard with immediate concern and protectiveness. "Did you know?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know that Mama put your name on my birth certificate?" Richard looked at the document on the screen, his own mind racing as he tried to understand the implications of what Sophie had found. He had never seen her birth certificate before, had never thought to request official documentation of his paternity. Elena's letter had seemed like sufficient explanation for their circumstances, and he had been so focused on building a relationship with Sophie that he hadn't delved into the legal paperwork surrounding her birth. "No, Sophie," he said honestly. "I had no idea your mother had listed me as your father on your birth certificate. I thought she had chosen not to name a father at all." Sophie studied his face with the intense scrutiny she applied to everything important in her life, searching for any sign of deception. What she saw there seemed to reassure her that he was telling the truth, but it only deepened her confusion about her mother's choices and motivations. "But if she knew your full name, if she knew enough about you to put you on my birth certificate, why did she say in the letter that she couldn't find you?" Sophie asked, her analytical mind working through the inconsistencies she had discovered. Richard felt a cold realization settling over him as he began to understand what Sophie had uncovered. Elena hadn't been unable to find him after he moved to San Francisco. She had known exactly who he was, had been following his career closely enough to list his full legal name on official documents. The story she had told in her letter about being unable to contact him had been, if not an outright lie, then certainly not the complete truth. "I think," Richard said carefully, choosing his words to be honest while still protecting Sophie from unnecessarily harsh judgments about her mother, "that your mother's reasons for not contacting me might have been more complicated than she explained in her letter." Sophie considered this for a moment, her mature mind grappling with concepts of adult motivation and decision-making that were far beyond what most children her age would be expected to understand. The discovery was forcing her to confront the possibility that Elena, the mother she had idealized and trusted completely, had made choices that weren't entirely honest or straightforward. "Do you think she lied to me?" Sophie asked. And Richard could hear the pain in her voice at the thought that her mother might have been less than truthful with her. Richard pulled Sophie closer to him on the couch, wrapping his arms around her in a gesture of comfort and security that had become natural. Between them over the past months, he could feel her small body trembling slightly with the emotional weight of her discovery. "I think your mother loved you more than anything in the world, and I think all of her decisions were made because she thought they were best for you," Richard said gently. "Sometimes adults make choices that seem right at the time, but turn out to be more complicated than they expected." Sophie leaned against Richard's chest, taking comfort in his steady presence as she worked through her conflicted feelings. The revelation had shaken her understanding of the story she had been told about her origins, but it hadn't changed the fundamental truth that Eleanor had been a loving and devoted mother who had sacrificed everything for her daughter's well-being. "What do you think really happened?" Sophie asked after several minutes of quiet contemplation. Richard considered the question carefully, knowing that his answer would shape Sophie's understanding of both her parents and their shared history. He wanted to be truthful while also helping her maintain respect and love for the mother who had raised her with such dedication. "I think your mother was probably scared," Richard said finally. "I think she knew that contacting me would change both our lives in ways she couldn't predict, and she was afraid that I might not be ready to be the father you deserved. So she made the choice to raise you herself, to give you all the love and attention you needed, and to wait until she thought the timing might be better for all of us." Sophie absorbed this explanation, her logical mind testing it against what she knew about Elena's personality and values. It made sense that her mother, who had always been cautious and thoughtful in her decisions, might have chosen to wait for what she perceived as the right moment to bring Richard into Sophie's life. "But then she got sick," Sophie said, continuing the narrative in her own mind, "and she realized she might not have time to wait for the perfect moment anymore." "Exactly," Richard agreed. "And that's when she wrote the letter and made the plan for you to find me. She knew that even if the timing wasn't perfect, you deserved to know your father, and I deserved the chance to know you." This explanation seemed to help Sophie reconcile the inconsistencies she had discovered. But Richard could see that the revelation had raised deeper questions about identity, trust, and the complex nature of adult relationships. She was grappling with concepts that would challenge someone much older, yet she was approaching them with the same intellectual curiosity and emotional intelligence that characterized everything else about her. "Are you angry at her?" Sophie asked, looking up at Richard with eyes that held both worry and hope. Richard considered the question seriously, examining his own feelings about Eleanor's choices and their consequences. Was he angry that she had kept Sophie from him for 7 years? Was he resentful that he had missed so much of his daughter's early life? The honest answer was complicated, involving feelings of loss and regret, but also profound gratitude for the extraordinary child Elena had raised. "I'm sad that I missed so much of your childhood," Richard said truthfully. "I'm sad that your mother felt she couldn't reach out to me when she was struggling. But I'm not angry, because I can see how much she loved you and how well she prepared you to be the amazing person you are today." Sophie nodded, seeming satisfied with this response. Her natural empathy allowed her to understand the complex emotions that adults experienced in difficult situations, and she could appreciate that Richard's feelings about Elena were nuanced rather than simply positive or negative. "Do you think things would have been different if she had contacted you when I was born?" Sophie asked, her curiosity about alternative scenarios reflecting the same analytical thinking she applied to her programming projects. "I think they would have been very different," Richard acknowledged, "but I don't think they necessarily would have been better. Your mother knew herself and she knew me, and she made the choices she thought were right for everyone involved. The important thing is that we found each other now, when we both needed family the most." This conversation marked a turning point in Sophie and Richard's relationship. The discovery of the birth certificate had forced them to confront the complex realities of adult decision-making and the sometimes imperfect nature of even well-intentioned choices. But rather than driving them apart, working through these difficult questions together had strengthened their bond and deepened their mutual trust. Over the following weeks, Sophie seemed to process the revelation about her birth certificate with the same remarkable resilience she had shown in dealing with Elena's death. She asked occasional questions about Elena's motivations and Richard's feelings, but she appeared to have accepted the complexity of the situation without allowing it to diminish her love for her mother or her growing affection for her father. Christmas was approaching, and Richard found himself experiencing the holiday season with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Victoria's death, he had reason to look forward to the celebrations, to think about gifts and traditions and the joy of sharing special moments with family. Sophie's presence in his life had transformed his perspective on everything from daily routines to long-term planning. They spent hours discussing what kind of Christmas celebrations Sophie would enjoy. She had always spent the holiday with Eleanor and Rosa, following traditions that reflected their Mexican heritage alongside typical American customs. Richard wanted to honor those established traditions while also creating new ones that would reflect their developing father-daughter relationship. Sophie surprised him by expressing interest in learning about Richard's own family traditions and heritage. She wanted to understand the paternal side of her genealogy with the same thoroughness she had applied to researching Elena's family history. This led to Richard sharing stories about his grandparents, his childhood celebrations, and the cultural influences that had shaped his own upbringing. "I want to know about all the parts of who I am," Sophie explained as they looked through photo albums from Richard's childhood. "Mama taught me about her family and our Mexican heritage. But I want to understand your family too, so I can know everything about where I come from." Richard was deeply moved by Sophie's desire to connect with his heritage and by her mature understanding that identity was composed of multiple influences and traditions. Together, they planned a Christmas celebration that would honor both sides of her family while creating new memories that belonged uniquely to them. On Christmas Eve, Sophie stayed overnight at Richard's apartment for what had become their weekly tradition. But this time, the occasion felt especially significant. They had spent the day volunteering together at a local food bank, an activity that Sophie had suggested because Elena had always emphasized the importance of helping others during the holiday season. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace in Richard's living room, Sophie opened a gift that Richard had been preparing for weeks. Inside an elegant wooden box were copies of every document related to her birth and early life that he had been able to obtain, including the birth certificate she had discovered on his computer. But more importantly, the box also contained a new document, adoption papers that would formally and legally establish Richard as Sophie's father. "If you want this," Richard explained as Sophie examined the papers with her usual careful attention to detail, "these would make it official that you're my daughter and I'm your father, not just by blood but by choice." Sophie looked up from the documents with eyes that were bright with tears of joy rather than sadness. "You want to adopt me officially?" "More than anything," Richard replied. "I want the world to know that you're my daughter. And I want you to have the security of knowing that I will always be your father, no matter what happens." Sophie set the papers aside and threw her arms around Richard in the most spontaneous and enthusiastic hug she had ever given him. In that moment, any lingering questions about Elena's choices or the circumstances that had brought them together seemed to fade away, replaced by the simple truth that they had found each other and chosen to become a family. "Yes," Sophie said, her voice muffled against Richard's shoulder, but clear in its conviction. "I want you to be my official dad." The adoption process took several months to complete, during which Sophie continued to split her time between Rosa's house and Richard's apartment. The legal proceedings were complicated by the fact that Richard was already listed on Sophie's birth certificate, but Elena's death and the need to establish clear custody arrangements required formal court approval. During this time, Richard and Sophie's relationship continued to deepen and evolve. Sophie's academic performance, already exceptional, seemed to flourish even more as she gained confidence and security from having her father's support and encouragement. Richard, meanwhile, discovered reserves of patience, creativity, and nurturing, instincts he had never known he possessed. They established routines and traditions that reflected both their shared interests and their individual personalities. Weekend mornings became dedicated to collaborative programming projects, with Sophie and Richard working together to develop applications that addressed real-world problems. Sophie's environmental consciousness and social awareness influenced the direction of these projects, leading them to create tools for tracking carbon footprints, organizing community volunteer efforts, and connecting families with educational resources. Richard also began including Sophie in appropriate aspects of his business life, bringing her to company events where she could interact with other technology professionals and see firsthand how the principles she was learning could be applied in professional settings. Sophie's presence at these events invariably impressed attendees with her knowledge, curiosity, and poise, while also reminding Richard's colleagues that he had priorities beyond work that brought him tremendous joy and fulfillment. The formal adoption was finalized on a bright day in March, with Rosa present as a witness and supporter of the new legal arrangement. The judge who presided over the proceedings was clearly moved by the obvious love and mutual respect between Richard and Sophie, commenting that it was rare to see such a natural and healthy parent-child relationship formed under unusual circumstances. As they left the courthouse with the official adoption decree in hand, Sophie surprised Richard by asking if they could visit Elena's grave. It had been several months since they had been there together, and Sophie felt that this milestone in their relationship deserved to be shared with the mother who had made it all possible. At the cemetery, Sophie knelt beside Elena's headstone and carefully placed a framed copy of the adoption papers against the marker. "Mama," she said softly, "I wanted you to know that Richard is officially my dad now, just like you hoped he would be. I think you would be happy about how everything worked out." Richard stood behind Sophie, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as she spoke to her mother. He felt Elena's presence in that moment, not in any supernatural sense, but in the profound love and wisdom she had built into her daughter, in the careful planning that had brought them together, and in the values she had instilled that continued to guide Sophie's choices and character. "Thank you, Elena," Richard said quietly, his words meant for the woman who had given him the greatest gift of his life. "Thank you for raising such an incredible daughter, and thank you for trusting me to be her father." As they walked back to the car, Sophie slipped her hand into Richard's with the natural ease that had developed between them over the months of building their relationship. The little girl who had approached him at Victoria's memorial service with Elena's letter was still recognizable in Sophie's serious intelligence and mature perspective, but she had also blossomed into a confident, joyful child who knew she was loved and valued. "Dad," Sophie said as they drove away from the cemetery, using the title that had become second nature to both of them, "do you think Mama knew that finding you would help me with missing her?" Richard considered the question, thinking about the profound loneliness he had felt after Victoria's death and how Sophie's presence had filled that emptiness with purpose and love. Elena had lost her husband when Sophie was young, had faced her final illness alone except for her daughter and sister. She would have understood the healing power of family connections, the way that new love could honor rather than replace what had been lost. "I think your mother was very wise about love and loss," Richard replied. "I think she knew that having family, having people who care about us and support us, makes it easier to carry the sadness of missing someone we love." Sophie nodded, satisfied with this explanation. "I still miss her every day, but it doesn't hurt as much now because I know I have you to take care of me and help me remember all the good things she taught me." As they drove through Seattle toward home, Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. The letter Elena had entrusted to Sophie had indeed changed everything, not just in revealing the existence of his daughter, but in transforming his understanding of love, family, and the unexpected ways that life could offer new beginnings even in the midst of profound loss. Sophie had taught him that being a parent meant more than providing for a child's physical and educational needs. It meant being present for the daily discoveries and challenges, celebrating small victories and offering comfort during difficult moments. It meant seeing the world through fresh eyes and remembering the wonder and possibility that could be found in everything from a successful computer program to a perfectly executed ballet move. In the months that followed the adoption, Sophie continued to thrive academically and personally. She skipped ahead another grade level, placing her with children 2 years older, but finally providing her with intellectual challenges that matched her capabilities. Richard enrolled her in advanced programming classes and science camps, while also ensuring that she had opportunities for typical childhood activities like sports, art, and music. Their weekend routines expanded to include hiking in the Cascade Mountains, where Sophie's love of nature and environmental science could flourish. They visited technology museums, attended lectures at the University of Washington, and traveled to conferences where Sophie could meet other young people who shared her interests in programming and scientific research. But perhaps most importantly, they simply enjoyed being a family. They cooked meals together, with Sophie insisting on learning both Elena's traditional Mexican recipes and some of Richard's favorite dishes from his own childhood. They read books together, ranging from advanced programming manuals to classic children's literature that Sophie had missed during her accelerated academic progression. They established holiday traditions that honored both Elena's memory and their own developing relationship. Christmas became a celebration that included volunteer work, family storytelling, and the exchange of gifts that reflected their shared interests and individual personalities. Sophie's birthday in May became an opportunity to celebrate not just her growing maturity, but also the anniversary of the family they had chosen to create together. Elena's prediction that Richard and Sophie would need each other had proven remarkably accurate. Richard had found in Sophie not just a daughter, but a purpose and joy that had helped him heal from the devastation of losing Victoria. Sophie had found in Richard not just a father, but a champion of her dreams and a steady source of love and security as she navigated the challenges of growing up without her mother. The letter that had brought them together remained in a place of honor in Richard's home office, framed alongside photographs of Sophie's achievements and milestones. It served as a daily reminder of Elena's wisdom and love, of the courage Sophie had shown in approaching him at Victoria's memorial service, and of the unexpected ways that loss could lead to new forms of love and family. As Sophie grew older, she began to understand even more deeply the sacrifice Elena had made in raising her alone, and the courage it had taken to plan for their eventual reunion. She also came to appreciate Richard's willingness to open his heart to an unknown daughter and to restructure his entire life around the responsibilities and joys of being her father. Their story became one of the most treasured narratives in their extended family and social circles, a testament to the power of love to transcend circumstances and create connections that might seem impossible, but proved to be exactly what everyone involved needed most. Sophie's approach to Richard at Victoria's memorial service, carrying Elena's letter with its power to change everything, had indeed transformed all their lives in ways that none of them could have imagined, but all of them came to treasure beyond measure. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.